Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. I'm Barbara Perry, and I'm the Director of Presidential Studies at the Miller Center, where I also co-chair with Russell Riley the Presidential Oral History Program. It's great to have you with us today to join us for what I know will be a fascinating conversation with our guest, Jeff Shesol. And this is about his book called Mercury Rising, which is the story of John Glenn, John Kennedy, and the space race in the context of the Cold War. Jeff comes to us from the West Wing Writers Group, which he founded as a speech writing business along with a strategic operation. And this comes from his experience as a speechwriter for President Clinton, and he did a number of landmark speeches for the 42nd president. He also has a background in history from Brown University and was a Rhodes Scholar, and so has a master's degree in history from Oxford. His previous books are on fascinating topics in and of themselves. One on Franklin Roosevelt and his tussle with the U.S. Supreme Court. The other is, speaking of tussles, on the conflict between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And so we were just talking before we went on camera. Jeff is just so good at developing dramatic tension. And I would say about this book, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I think I may have mentioned to him, I certainly did others, that when I'm getting ready to moderate a book discussion, I assign myself so many pages of the book to read a day so that I make sure I'm finished with it by the time the discussion begins. And this one I assigned myself some time ago, 10 pages a day. But it was literally a page turner. So I kept going past the 10 pages and read it in record time. So I highly recommend it to you. It's a little bit like if any of you out there have seen the movie Apollo 13. I watch that movie every time it's on TV, and I always burst into tears when they're all rescued. And I know they're rescued, but the tension always remains. In this book, we know that John Glenn eventually successfully goes into space and becomes the first American to orbit the Earth. But there again is just that tension and that wondering, will this happen and how it will happen. So be sure to pick up the book. It's a great, great gift for the upcoming holiday season, and I know you will love it. And maybe there will be a movie about it, Jeff. So welcome, Jeff. We also welcome your questions, not just at the end of our hour today. Please begin to give us your questions as we go along, because we want to be sure to include them as we go through our discussion. The other thing that I mentioned to Jeff in preparing for today was that this feels like such a personal book to me because of my generational cohort. I feel like I knew all the characters, starting with Sputnik, which is one of the first characters in the book. And that's because my dad used to tell tales of stopping at a park on the Ohio River in our hometown of Louisville to watch after work at this big open park, Sputnik go overhead. And that just seemed so interesting and foreign and somewhat scary as he told the story. But he had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, and been taken to the bicycle shop where the Wright brothers discovered their concept of wanting to fly. So he always had a thing for aviation. Then my mother took me to see John F. Kennedy in our hometown of Louisville in 1960. My dad, a couple of years later, took us to see Eisenhower. So two more characters in this book. And then finally, my aunt and uncle lived at Merritt Island, Florida, right next to Cape Canaveral at the very time that Jeff's book takes place about the Mercury Project. And one time they brought us a PR packet of the Mercury Project. And so it had biographies of all the Mercury astronauts and a beautiful glossy 8x10 photograph of a rocket taking off. So I got many term papers out of that in grade school. And finally, for that point, in second grade, I came home and said to Mother, I have to write an essay on the person I most admire. And she said, write it on John Glenn, because obviously that was the person she most admired at that time. So with that, Jeff, let's open up. Thanks so much for being here and bringing this great book to us. And thanks also to Christina and Mike and Woody and Rob and all of our tech team that makes this possible. Want to talk to you about the space race. I was listening this morning to Golden Oldies from the 60s, and they literally introduced these songs from the 60s, and they said, this is the soundtrack of the space race. And they had a clip of President Kennedy speaking in 1962, his famous speech at Rice University in Houston about, we choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. So tell us, how did he jump into this space race? How did it become a race? And can you place it in that context of the Cold War?
Well, first of all, Barbara, thank you for that really generous introduction. Thanks to you and Christina and all of you for having me here today. I'm excited to talk with all of you about all of this. And let's start with the race. What's interesting about that term, space race, is that both Eisenhower and Kennedy really resented it. They really shied from calling it a race, from frankly admitting that it was a race, because they felt that to adopt that terminology was to get backed into a competition with the Soviet Union that we might lose. In fact, that we were losing from the very beginning, from the moment when the Soviets sent that first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit around the Earth in October of '57. And there was a whole series of firsts that followed that, where the Soviet domination of the heavens was well established within from the first moments of the space race. So Eisenhower decided that if he sort of talked it down a little bit, that he might take the edge off the competition, because frankly, Eisenhower he wasn't invested in it, literally or figuratively. He wasn't emotionally invested in it. He wasn't politically invested in it. And he really refused, as long as he could, to invest federal dollars in some kind of competition with the Soviet Union. For what purpose? He didn't really see the purpose. Eisenhower really had only one particular interest in space, and that was reconnaissance satellites. He hoped that he could replace those very dicey and dangerous U-2 spy plane flights over the Soviet Union and replace them with spy satellites who could do the same thing more effectively and guard against the possibility of a surprise nuclear attack. Beyond that, he had no interest in science and space. He had even less interest in human beings in space. He saw no justification for it. As Eisenhower put it, we have no enemies on the moon. So he didn't see why we needed to suit up literally military pilots, test pilots, and send them into space. So this was a tension throughout the remainder of Eisenhower's presidency. Interestingly, when John Kennedy enters this discussion in 1960, he really had very little time for space prior to that. He was not, like some other politicians, particularly interested in talking about it in '57, '58. But in 1960, Kennedy saw the power of space as a political issue, that the failure of the United States to compete effectively with the Soviet Union represented, as far as Kennedy was concerned, all of the ways in which the United States had lost its initiative, its drive, its vigor, as he said, during the Eisenhower-Nixon years. And so he ran in part on closing the space gap. But the truth is that when he entered office, he had a lot of other pressing priorities. I know we'll talk about those. And space really wasn't one of them. And he too avoided the term space race as long as he possibly could, really until April of 1961, when the Soviets achieved the greatest first of all, which was sending the first human being into space, Yuri Gagarin.
So we really were behind. Call it what you will, if you don't want to call it a space race, and if Eisenhower and Kennedy at first didn't want to do that, and in part, I guess you don't want to identify a race that you are behind in. And tell us, Jeff, about all of the disasters, aside from the political disasters that Kennedy was facing, but the disasters that we kept achieving, if you will, in the rocketry realm after Sputnik and all the way through 1960-61.
Well, the first disaster was simply getting beaten to the punch by the Soviets, and that was Sputnik, as we're discussing. But there was also Sputnik 2, which was only a month later, in November of 1957. They sent a much heavier craft into space, into orbit, carrying a dog, Laika. Now, Laika didn't make it back to Earth. Laika died in space. But the fact that the Russians were able to heave something as heavy as that into orbit around the Earth and actually have an animal in it survive for a period of time was absolutely incredible. And in fact, scientists in the United States and engineers wondered aloud on the front pages of the New York Times whether the Soviets had discovered some new form of energy, some new form of propulsion that could account for their ability to do this with ease. And they hadn't. They had just a simply much more powerful rocket than we did. But again, there was a sense of awe at what the Soviets were able to achieve. And meanwhile, as you suggested, Barbara, here in the United States, we were regularly treated to the spectacle of our rockets blowing up on the launch pad. Now, the Russians had their own rockets blowing up on their own launch pads, but nobody saw it because, of course, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian regime. And there was so much secrecy surrounding the Soviet space program that nobody even knew where the launch pad was. It happened to be in the middle of Kazakhstan, but there were a lot of rumors that it was in a lot of other places than that. We just didn't know. And so when the Soviets had their own horrific accidents, and they certainly had some, we didn't know about it. Whereas the United States, being, of course, an open society with a free press and inviting the press from around the world to watch, anytime one of our rockets blew up on the launch pad, anytime one of our little squirrel monkeys was put in the nose cone of one of these things and was meant to be shot into space and wound up getting shot into the Atlantic because the missile had to be blown up because it was going in the wrong direction, the world knew about it instantly. And so there was a sense of mounting failure in the United States, and the world was watching.
Well, we already have a question, Jeff, from one of our viewers today, Lisa, and it really fits right in squarely with what we're talking about, and that is that, after the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of documents were opened, and scholars and writers and authors have been going through those for years to get a portrait of what was happening in the Soviet Union, certainly at that time. Did you find that you had access to any of these sources that might not have been available before the Soviet Union collapsed?
Well, I did by virtue of others' research. I did not spend time in the Russian archives myself. I don't speak Russian, so I wouldn't be able to read the documents, but there have been some really impressive dogged historians who have been doing that digging and unearthing some really fascinating and unknown stuff about the Soviet space program. So I benefited from their research. And one of the things that they revealed is what we were just discussing a minute ago, which is, again, the failures of the Soviet space program. In 1960, they had a rocket explode on the launch pad that killed 100 people. We had nothing like that happen here in the United States. I mean, there were a lot of rockets exploding, but they weren't killing people. We've been very lucky in that regard, and also, frankly, taking more precautions than the Russians have been taking. They also, and I think this wasn't known, if I remember right, I think this might not have been known until the 1990s, but one of their cosmonauts died in a horrific training fire. Again, nobody knew about any of this for many decades because of the nature of the regime.
Well, tell us, in light of the title of your book, Mercury Rising, tell us about Project Mercury. And again, in my mind's eye, I see that portrait of the astronauts in their spacesuits. And tell us about how they were chosen, and then a little bit about the competition among them. That was one of the many enlightenments that I had from reading the book. I didn't realize, I knew from the movie and the book, The Right Stuff, that yes, they were competitive people, but I just didn't realize the personal and professional competition that went on among them.
It was an incredibly intense competition. I think they engaged first in an incredible competition, as you're saying, just to become astronauts. And we can talk a little bit about that. But of course, the moment they had been selected as the first group of astronauts, the first group of Americans who had a shot at going into space, the competition then began to become that first American. And so they were all competing against one another. They had to operate as a team, as a unit. They were all training together. They were all learning together. And yet they were well aware, and they were quite open about this, that they were competing with one another to become the first, because they were competitive guys, and because there was a sense that the first person in space would be immortal and would go down in all of human history. There was a lot of talk in the press right from the beginning that this would be the new Columbus. That was always the reference point, entering this new frontier of space. And they all wanted to be that guy, and they all had a shot at it. And so the competition could be quite intense. But first, how did they get there? There was some discussion in the early days of NASA. NASA was created. That's a story in itself that we could talk about, was the creation of NASA, which is something that Eisenhower did essentially against his will in 1958. There was just enough political pressure that he ultimately had to go ahead and do something, and created a civilian space agency, and drew man in space, as it was referred to at the time, drew man in space programs away from the military and invested it in this civilian organization, NASA. And then there was the question of who could qualify to be an astronaut. I mean, what is the skill set of an astronaut? At that point, they weren't even necessarily talking about astronauts flying these capsules. One of the interesting things that I found was a lot of tension between within the program and much debate among the scientists and engineers as to whether human beings were even capable of functioning in a weightless environment, capable of functioning in space, or whether all sorts of horrible things, and they listed them in these memos, and it can be comical in retrospect, but it wasn't comical at the time. All the horrible things that might happen to a human being's body and brain and eyes and everything, nervous system up in space. And so on the part of those who were designing the equipment that they were going up in, their predisposition was to make sure that the astronauts left well enough alone, kept their hands off the controls, and had the whole thing fly on autopilot. In fact, there was some discussion in the late 1950s that the best way of achieving that would be to shoot them full of sedatives before they went up into space, so they would be too out of it to mess with anything. I mean, this was the bias against the pilots. So they weren't necessarily sure that they needed the most skilled pilots. And yet, as the discussion evolved, it seemed clear that if you were going to put someone in a high altitude, high performance, high speed aircraft, that it probably ought to be somebody who had done that before, even if they hadn't ever been to space, of course. And so Eisenhower limited the pool to military test pilots. There was also the sense that because they were in the military, they could be trusted to keep this whole thing confidential to the extent that it needed to. So that was the pool. And then there was a question of balance. The Air Force pilots, Navy pilots. John Glenn was a Marine pilot, and he almost was overlooked because the Navy wasn't that interested in bringing Marines into its pool. And that was an error that was caught at the last minute, making it possible for John Glenn to become an astronaut. So those selections were made. And then, as I said, the astronauts were announced to the public in April of 1959. They walked out on the stage at the old NASA headquarters, which was in the Dolly Madison House, just across the street, essentially from the White House. And instantly they were on the cover of every magazine, Life magazine, and the newsreels. And then the real competition began, as I said before.
Well, let's introduce the main character really in this book is John Glenn. And you get so many books in one with your tome. And that's because it's also a biography really of John Glenn. And there you could tell delved into his papers, which are, I believe, at Ohio State. Talked to his family, his two children, his widow Annie only just recently passed away. So we'll talk a little bit more about her because she's also an important character in this story. But tell us about John Glenn for people who don't remember that time or have perhaps forgotten some of the details of his life. He really had kind of an all-American background, didn't he?
He absolutely did. I mean, he grew up in a tiny little town. I mean, we talk about small town America. This is small town America. It's a little town, still little, called New Concord, Ohio. It's in southeastern Ohio. And at the time, the population was about 1,000 people. It's about a mile across. That was his world. And it was pretty monocultural town, as you would expect. Totally white, almost totally Presbyterian. A little bit Methodist, I believe. And it was idyllic in the way that small town, white, middle class, middle America has long seemed idyllic to certain Americans. And that was his environment. He emerged from that. He had a close-knit relationship with his parents. He did well in school. He did not suffer unduly during the Depression. It was a pretty happy childhood, a pretty happy upbringing. And really all he wanted to do as soon as he learned about it was to fly. He got his first chance when he was 8 years old, and his father was driving to a plumbing job in a neighboring town. His father was a plumber, and young John, or Bud as he was known at the time, was along for the ride. And they saw an airfield where a pilot was taking people up for essentially joy rides around the countryside. And so Glenn's father paid the man a couple of bucks, and they climbed in the plane and they circled around for a little while, and that was it. I mean, that he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He just wasn't sure he was ever going to get to do it. And it really wasn't until the eve of World War II when the federal government began a civilian pilot training program, because it was understood we were going to need some pilots pretty soon, that Glenn was able to sign up and get some real training. And he then volunteered enlisted after Pearl Harbor, and wasn't able to see combat until later in the war in the South Pacific in '44. But I want to just kind of take a moment to pull back the frame. I think one of the things that always fascinated me about John Glenn, and increasingly fascinated me as I began to explore the subject of his life, is that I felt that there was something missing from the popular portrayals. If you watch The Right Stuff, that great film, or read the even better book by Tom Wolfe, it's fantastic. And yet Glenn is kind of a two-dimensional figure. He's a Boy Scout. He's a Sunday school teacher. He is that kind of all-American boy. Now, all of that was true. He was actually a scout. He was actually a Sunday school teacher. He was as all-American as they got. And at the same time, it seemed to me that Glenn never would have been able to achieve what he achieved if there wasn't something more to the picture. And so wonderfully for the historian, you mentioned the archives, the Glenn archives at Ohio State. Glenn saved everything. I mean, he saved the papers that he wrote as a kid. He saved all of his high school papers. He saved all the ephemera that any historian would ever want to get their hands on. And you can begin to sort of draw out a sense of John Glenn, both in his youth and particularly after his youth. His diaries during World War II, his letters home from the Korean War. And you get a sense of a more restless, more ambitious, more competitive John Glenn than you would ever see in any of the kind of pop cultural portrayals. And it's not an altogether different John Glenn, but it is a more three-dimensional figure, I hope. And you get a sense of Glenn as one of his childhood friends, but a man who wanted more than any other man that he knew. And that was Glenn. And the other thing that I would add in that regard is that while Glenn seemed to be the only one of the Mercury Seven who didn't kind of walk with a swagger in his step, who did have that touch of the Sunday school teacher to him, he was the most decorated combat pilot of all of the Mercury Seven. Not even all of them had fought in combat, but of the ones who did, Glenn was the most decorated. And he was a fierce combat pilot. And so there's a lot more to John Glenn. And when you understand that, when you're able to immerse yourself in the letters and the diaries, you begin to understand how he was capable of doing in space what he was able to do.
Brian Craig, who's one of our professional researchers for our presidential oral history program, has a question about, he said, is it true that NASA officials and astronauts were concerned about JFK when he came into office, or the astronauts who had already been chosen? Did they worry that he didn't put enough priority? You've spoken about how he didn't put a huge priority, a premium, certainly in the campaign. He focused more on the so-called missile gap with the Soviet Union in that sense. But were they concerned that he would be even less interested than Eisenhower?
They were concerned, ironically, because as I mentioned before, he had partly campaigned on the issue. And what he said repeatedly on the campaign trail was that it was unacceptable for the United States to be second in space. That to be second in space was to be second in the eyes of the world in science and technology, in military power, and in the larger struggle between freedom and totalitarianism. So he said that was unacceptable, and yet he had been so vague about what he intended to do about it that NASA was full of a lot of anxiety that he might do anything from dramatically increase the budget to take man in space and give it back to the Navy and militarize the whole operation in a way that Eisenhower had never wanted to do, or simply cancel the manned space program altogether and invest all that money in other kinds of activities in space, again with more of a military inclination. So there was powerful uncertainty at NASA. And the outgoing administrator of NASA, the first administrator, a guy named Keith Glennon, who was sort of an Eisenhower man through and through, couldn't even get a meeting with Kennedy. And he recorded in his diary, and I write about this in the book, no word from the Kennedy administration. And he began to end every single diary entry with that line, and it extended all the way through Inauguration Day and beyond. And so there was deep concern in NASA that nobody knew which way Kennedy was going to go, and the only clue that anybody thought they had was that Kennedy had asked the man who became his science advisor, a man named Jerome Wisner, who was a powerful sort of intellectual and scientific figure coming out of MIT, had been on the Manhattan Project. He had asked Wisner to review, during the transition, to review NASA and the space program as a whole. And Wisner did a pretty cursory review, and he came back with a report that was intensely critical of the whole program, and actually said to Kennedy, and this leaked and was in the papers around the country, said that the leadership of NASA was inept, and said that Project Mercury was such a disaster that Kennedy should distance himself from it so that he didn't get blamed for its inevitable failure.
Well, tell us then, Jeff, so soon into Kennedy's administration, by, what was it, May of 61, he gives another famous speech that will become viewed as the real kickoff of the space race, the race to the moon, because he says before Congress in a speech in the spring of 61 that we have this goal now to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. So what changed between the campaign and inauguration and those first few months of the Kennedy administration?
What changed was the reality, was the stark fact of a Soviet man in space. As I mentioned before, Yuri Gagarin became the first person in space in April of 1961. And even though that had been long expected, it was either going to be a Russian around that time or it was going to be an American around that time. We were very close to being able to send our first astronaut, who wound up being Alan Shepard, into space. He followed Gagarin in fairly short succession, although it was not an orbital flight for Shepard. It was a suborbital flight, like the one that Jeff Bezos took. It went up, it came down, 15 minutes from start to finish, because our rockets weren't powerful enough to get somebody into orbit. Nonetheless, even though it had been anticipated for a while, the fact of it actually happening and the reaction in the United States and around the world made it clear to Kennedy that his months of delay were coming home to bite him in a very painful and powerful way. And he had been looking around the world at other more significant crises, from the civil war in Laos that was threatening to bring the United States into it, to what was going on in Cuba and that threat on our doorstep, to the long and incredibly dangerous and potentially nuclear conflict in Berlin. There were all these problems around the world, never mind what was happening domestically in the United States. And so Kennedy really had neglected the issue, and now it was front and center. And now the Russians were holding victory parades and amassing hundreds of thousands of people in Moscow to celebrate this great achievement, not just of the Soviet space program, but of communism. And this was a powerful weapon in this ideological struggle. And the United States was losing that struggle. So Kennedy recognizes in that moment that he needs to do something quick and he needs to do something big. Now, the quick part was in a way the harder part, because the US was behind, as we've been discussing, and there was no quick fix. There was no way to just suddenly catch up. And again, even though we were ready to send Alan Shepard into space, it wasn't going to be an orbital flight, and Gagarin's was. So it was going to look less impressive as a result of what the Russians had already done. And so the conversation began immediately. What do we do? When and how can we possibly catch up to the Soviet Union? And he turned to Lyndon Johnson to help him answer that question. Because Johnson, I said Kennedy wasn't really engaged on the issue of space until 1960. Well, Lyndon Johnson was engaged from the moment that Sputnik went up. That very day, he jumped into the fray. And he was the principal mover behind NASA, for example. And so he was Kennedy's point person in the White House on space. And Kennedy turned to Johnson and said, help me figure this out. And Johnson already knew the answer. And he went around amassing support very quickly for it from other parts of the government. And that was that we had to pledge to go to the moon. This was something that had been discussed within NASA and elsewhere for some time, but never that seriously. But what Johnson saw and what ultimately Kennedy concluded was that if we weren't going to be able to catch the Soviets in the next couple of years, maybe if you set a goal that was almost a decade away, a goal that was going to require the creation of new technology that no one had envisioned, that was going to require massive expenditure over a very long period of time, well, maybe we would have the opportunity over the next 9-10 years to leapfrog the Soviets and get to the moon before they did. And so that was the motivator of the goal of the moonshot. And Kennedy came out and announced it, as you said, Barbara, at the end of May 1961.
So interesting that you use that terminology, moonshot, because we hear that now, whether that's to find a cure for cancer, the climate crisis. I always point out that President Kennedy's only grandson, Jack Schlossberg, when the family commemorated the 100th birthday of President Kennedy in 2017, the family, led by Caroline Kennedy, made a video. She kicked it off, and then the 3 grandchildren of President Kennedy made a comment. And Jack Schlossberg's comment was that he just loves the Rice speech of his grandfather because he thinks for his generation, the Schlossbergs, that this will be a moonshot for climate change, the climate crisis. So that goes down in history as when you reach for the stars, when you reach for the moon. And another phrase that you used was this new frontier of space. So in some ways, it's a little bit ironic that Kennedy didn't jump in with both feet sooner, given his New Frontier speech at the Democratic Convention in 1960, which is his acceptance speech for the Democratic nomination. And he does talk about the frontier of space. You know, we stand here in California with the country behind us and on the edge of a new frontier. And one of those new frontiers is space. Do you think, Jeff, that the timing of May to give that congressional speech in 1961, you mentioned all the crises around the world, and you made mention of here at home, the freedom rides are beginning. Obviously, civil rights is bubbling up. We have all sorts of domestic issues that the president needs to face. But do you think the timing of just after the fiasco of Bay of Pigs is also part of this more positive approach to fighting the Soviets?
Well, it's interesting. There were, and I'm glad you mentioned the Bay of Pigs, because of course that's a huge factor in all of this. Gagarin's flight was on April 12th, and the Bay of Pigs begins in earnest on the 17th. So short succession, 2 just gut punches to the United States. And both of them, in a way, self-inflicted. You could look at Gagarin's flight as a self-inflicted wound, and that the delays and the underfunding and all the problems in the U.S. space program had cost us the opportunity to beat the Soviet Union into space. But certainly Bay of Pigs was a powerfully self-inflicted wound. Actually, interestingly, the Bay of Pigs made Kennedy for a moment more hesitant to move forward aggressively with the space program. As I mentioned, the Shepard flight was being scheduled and rescheduled, and right around that time. And immediately after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy faced a go, no-go decision on whether to send Shepard into space. Normally, a president wouldn't get involved in a decision like that. It would really be purely up to NASA. But just given what was going on in the world, and again, the blows to U.S. prestige, the matter had to be brought to President Kennedy. And most of his advisors said, look, we don't know if Shepard is going to survive this thing getting off the launch pad. And after Gagarin and the Bay of Pigs, to have another disaster just a couple of weeks later you'd never recover from that. And the United States might never recover for quite a while in the eyes of the world. So, we should just postpone this thing. And there were a couple who argued the other approach, and Kennedy just accepted that there was a kind of inevitability to the launch, and that he had to accept it and hope that actually, if it was successful, that it might help turn the tide of opinion in the favor of the United States. So the moonshot decision and announcement follow just by a matter of days and weeks, the successful Shepard launch. So all of these things are related. And really, Barbara, this is the larger story that I wanted to tell in this book. Just again, to take a step back for a second. I have a shelf full of books. It's on the other side of the screen. I have a shelf full of books about space and the space program and astronaut memoirs. And then I've got another shelf of Cold War books. And there's very little overlap between the storytelling. And the space books, of course, acknowledge that we were racing against the Russians, but the Cold War is sort of background noise or atmosphere. And the Cold War books are more focused on Berlin and Cuba and all of these other areas that we're talking about. But when you actually sort of get your head and your research into the moment and what Kennedy was being presented with in any given week of his presidency, and the way he was thinking about space and what it was related to and the whys of the space program, then the two storylines start to align and they become part of the same story. And we talked today about the moonshot, as you said, and moonshots in other areas, but there would have been no moonshot as far as Kennedy was concerned, if not for the national security threat that was posed by the Soviets in space, or was seen to be posed by the Soviets in space. Kennedy in 1960 picked up an old line of Lyndon Johnson's and campaigned on it by saying that if the Soviets controlled space, they could control life here on Earth. And there was a fear, a very powerful fear on the part of a lot of experts, that what the Russians really wanted to do up there was to build a space station that was armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, and to just have that hang like a sword of Damocles above the United States, or that the Soviets would build a nuclear base on the moon that was beyond the reach of US defenses. And so this, for Kennedy, that's the real driver, that's the real motivator.
I'm also thinking at this time, Jeff, about also with, and again, this is the beauty of this book, is to tie all of this together, Kennedy, Glenn, the Mercury program, into this context of the Cold War that you do so skillfully. But I'm also thinking at this time, the Peace Corps is founded. And that part of that reasoning, of course, was Cold War politics, that the Soviets were sending their experts, particularly scientific experts around the world, to the developing countries that we then called Third World. And in this, sometimes I'll do seminars and for Gilder Lehrman Institute, for example, and they'll say, be sure to define what is the Cold War, because we have now many generations of students who didn't live through the Cold War. To me, my dad wanted to build a bomb shelter in the backyard in the 1960s after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my slightly more practical mother said, honey, you can put extra food and water in the basement, but we're not digging up the backyard. I guess because my dad had seen Sputnik go over, he was a little more concerned than she. But newspapers of the day were giving instructions on how to build a bomb shelter in your backyard. So all of this context, that it fascinates me that this was also part of this race, but also just the conflict between these two superpowers to get the developing nations to come to our side, come to the free world. And so to be falling farther and farther behind the communist world in this bipolar world led by the Soviets certainly was on Kennedy's mind. And I also wanted to mention, Jeff, the tapes that we have at the Miller Center, the presidential recordings, the so-called secret White House tapes, that we have many, many of these tapes that have been edited and transcribed and analyzed by our colleagues Mark Silverstone and Guillaume McKee and Carrie Matthews and our whole team, of Kennedy talking about the space program, especially with James Webb, who became the head of NASA. And you hear in real time these meetings going on in the White House where sometimes NASA is trying to make the case to Kennedy about science and all that we will learn about science. And at one point, Kennedy says, I'm not as interested in that. I just want to beat the Soviets. And it feels like the Olympics during the Cold War. So having said that, let me back up to Alan Shepard and that first suborbital flight. How did Alan Shepard get the nod for that over John Glenn? And why was Glenn third in the rota, but actually ended up getting the premier shot by being the first American to orbit the Earth?
Well, I should, in full honesty, I should admit up front, this remains a mystery. There is no memo, there is no smoking gun that says this is why it's going to be Alan Shepard. And there are a lot of different accounts, but here's what I've been able to put together. First of all, Alan Shepard was a phenomenal pilot, but of course, so was John Glenn. They were understood within the program to be the two most impressive pilots and really leaders of the Mercury 7. They were the standout personalities. It was clear from moment one when they walked in the door that these were the strongest personalities. They were probably likely to clash, and that the real competition was between the two of them. And they had very different styles. I mean, I called them leaders, but the truth is, and Shepard admitted this himself, he wasn't that interested in leading. He was interested in winning. Glenn was interested really in both. Glenn had always been a leader in every environment that he'd been in, and he expected, probably without even being that without admitting it to himself, that he expected that he would be looked to as the oldest astronaut, as I said before, the most decorated combat veteran among the astronauts, and the only famous astronaut. He was the only one who was famous before he became an astronaut. He had become famous a couple of years earlier by setting a transcontinental speed record, flying a jet from LA to Brooklyn in 3 hours and 23 minutes. He wound up on the front page of every newspaper in the country in 1957 and wound up with a 5-week stint on Name That Tune on the CBS game show, which made him a household name in the United States.
By the way, I recommend everybody go to YouTube. You can actually watch it. And he was on with the child actor Eddie Hodges. Actually, one of my favorite child actors from the Frank Sinatra movie, Hole in the Head.
That's right. That's right.
So it's an amazing pair. And I had no idea that John Glenn had done that.
And the two of them were like a vaudeville act. I mean, it was like they did this for a living. And as you said, Eddie Hodges went on to do this for a living for a while. He was in The Music Man on Broadway. And Glenn was a total natural. He just charmed the country. And his charisma just shone through on that program. And so for all of these reasons, Glenn was seen by the country and the press that was reporting on the space program as really the first among equals. Shepard was unknown to them, but within the program, he was seen to being incredibly competitive and incredibly effective. And so you had these two clashing and competing. But there were a couple things that were working against John Glenn. And one was there was a lot of resentment of that fame. There was a lot of resentment among the other astronauts and within NASA generally about Glenn's celebrity and the feeling that that was going to skew the contest, as if that was somehow an important element in all this. And so there was a lot of resentment from the beginning. It was compounded by the fact that Glenn, as a religious person, as an incredibly devoted husband and family man, was often scolding the other astronauts and warning the other astronauts that they should stop frequenting the bars in Cocoa Beach outside Cape Canaveral and getting drunk with women who were not their wives and going home with those women. And Glenn warned them that they were they were endangering not only their own reputations, but the program and the United States in the eyes of the world. That didn't go down particularly well, as you might expect, with this group of guys who were kind of living that lifestyle, which was common among fighter pilots in the 1950s, and probably among others. And so that was a tension as well. But then there were other tensions with senior managers at NASA. Much later in Glenn's life, when he was running for president in 1984, a reporter for the New York Times described what he called Glenn's prickly integrity. And this comes into play during those NASA years, both in terms of how he talked to the other astronauts about their extramarital affairs, but also how Glenn talked to his so-called superiors at NASA about real issues, such as I mentioned earlier, the tension over whether the astronauts would actually get to fly those capsules or whether they were just going to be like the chimpanzees in the tests, passengers within them. Glenn led that fight on behalf of the other astronauts. And he certainly ruffled a lot of feathers among the senior managers at NASA. So were these elements in the decision that Shepard would get the big prize and that Glenn would be his backup? Maybe. I can't say for sure. But again, in talking to those who were present at the creation, it does seem that these were important elements in that decision. And Glenn was not only made Shepard's backup, but then Gus Grissom was the second astronaut to fly, and Glenn was made backup again. So the indignity for Glenn, particularly given the assumption in the country and on Glenn's own part that he would have been first. It was. I mean, it's funny to say this is not what most people would consider to be real hardship, but this was the toughest period of Glenn's life. Absolutely,
Really,
the humiliation of it.
Depressing time for him. So maybe let's bring Annie Glenn into the picture now, because she's always behind him, bolstering him. Let's talk about her and their marriage.
Well, John and Annie Glenn had, in a way, been together since they were 2 and 3 years old, respectively. She was a year older than him. They met in a playpen in New Concord. Their families went to church together and were part of a small group of families that got together every week. And the kids were thrown into a playpen together. They went to school together, and in high school, they started dating, and they were together for the rest of their lives. So in a way, since Glenn died at 95, Annie died, as you mentioned, recently at 100. They were essentially together for 90 years. And they had an incredible marriage, an incredible partnership. One of the staffers in John Glenn's Senate office years later said, the main thing that you need to know about John Glenn, and people would naturally assume he's going to say that he was an astronaut, that he, went into space. No, he said the main thing that you need to know about John Glenn is that he loves his wife. That, as far as Glenn was concerned, was the most important thing in his life, and he lived it that way. And one of the other really remarkable things about Annie Glenn is that, and about both of them in a way, is that Annie Glenn had a really extreme stutter, a stutter that was so extreme that, particularly during less enlightened times, growing up in small town in the 30s and 20s and 30s, that people would simply just walk away from her. When kids would make fun of her, adults would look askance, and well into adulthood, she would go into a store to buy something and be unable to speak, and clerks would simply walk away from her. And so it was a really disabling stutter. And to Glenn, it didn't matter at all. He didn't condescend to her, and he was her support, and in a way, her voice outside in the outer world. But he certainly looked to her in that marriage as at the very least an equal partner. And thankfully, years later, I think in her 40s, she was finally able to find a kind of speech therapy that worked for her brilliantly, and she was able to overcome her stutter, did a lot of public speaking, and really became an advocate for many decades for people who face similar struggles.
That in and of itself is an amazing story, isn't it? Before we get to the climax of the book, which is, of course, Glenn's flight, tell us about how he prepared his family, what he wrote to them, recordings that he made, and that sort of thing. Because I have to say, they brought me to tears. I think I can say I've never become tearful reading a book. I often become tearful watching movies. But again, because your dramatic tension and the way you tell the story is so compelling, I was brought to tears by what he told his family before that flight.
Well, I had the same reaction, not by my own book, but by finding the document and the files, which was really very unexpected. And what we're referring to here is I was at the Glenn Archives, again, at Ohio State, and flipping through the files looking for something else, but opening every other file along the way, because you never know what you're going to find as a researcher. And I found a stack of handwritten notes on yellow legal paper. I thought, well, what's this? And it begins with the line, "If you hear this, I've been killed." And it proceeds from there. And what it is, as I was able to determine, is that it's Glenn's notes. It's a script that he wrote for himself, for a recording that he made on a reel-to-reel tape for his kids who were teenagers. And it was saying everything that he wanted to say to them if he didn't come home alive. And it would only be played for them if he died on this mission to go to space. And he did a similar recording for his wife, Annie. And we know that this was on his mind in those very last minutes before he was shot into space at the top of that Atlas rocket, because he was patched through to speak to Annie, who was at home in Arlington, Virginia, on the phone. In addition to sort of saying their goodbyes, Glenn said, "Did you get the recordings that I sent you?" And she said, "Yes." And no one had really known up to this point what Glenn might have been referring to in that moment, but putting that together with what I found on paper. And it's incredibly chilling, incredibly powerful and moving, and it's full of his feelings about faith, his relationship with God, his views of an afterlife, his feelings about courage, why he felt that his death was a sacrifice worth making, even though he knew it was going to cause his family pain. It's an incredibly personal document, and it was remarkable to find that something like that had survived. And I think in terms of the larger question of how he prepared his family, because Glenn was the oldest astronaut, and he was when he went up into space, he was approaching, or he just turned 40 the previous summer, and so his kids were the oldest of the astronauts' kids. I mean, some of the other astronauts had 3-4-year-old kids, but these were teenagers, as I said before. And so they knew a lot more, and they were going to find out a lot more whether or not he told them. And he felt that the best way to address the fears that he knew they had was to give them as much information as possible, to bring home blueprints, to show them how the booster rocket was constructed and where the fuel is, and where the environmental control system in the capsule was, and how this works and how that works. And he felt that the more information they had, the more they would come to understand that NASA was doing its work effectively, and that he was going to be okay. So he really brought them into the process, and even gave them an opportunity to help name his capsule, Friendship 7. They were a big part of that process. He wanted them to feel involved in it, invested in it, and not to hide either the dangers from them or the excitement.
The most affecting line for me in the letter to the children was, if I die and you're at the funeral, I guess he knew it would be at Arlington National Cemetery. And he said, and if you're really feeling overcome with emotion, step outside the tent, look up at the highest tree you can see, and it will be waving. And that will be me. That will be me. And you'll know that I'm with you. And that's what made me tearful. It was just so beautifully done.
It's an incredible thing. I mean, it's and interestingly, I had also found a letter that he wrote his kids shortly before that, where his tone was a little more upbeat, and said, "I think everything's going to be fine, but at a moment like this, it's natural to take stock of everything, and I just want you to think about, I want you to know what kind of people I want you to be when you grow up. I want you to have these qualities of courage and integrity and so forth." So in a way, he's doing the same thing in that letter, but it's presented differently. And then he went back to his essentially isolation chamber. I mean, not exactly so, but he was holed up at Hangar S in Cape Canaveral, because they wanted to protect him not only from the press, but from the possibility that he would catch a cold, which would cause him to be scrubbed from the mission. And he sat and he brooded about the very real possibility that he would become the first American, or the first person, to die in space. And that's when he wrote that script and made that recording that he then sent home. The dangers were, I think this is actually still hard for us to appreciate, because we know, as you said at the beginning of the hour, we know that he gets back safely. But they didn't know at the time that he was going to get back safely. The Mercury 7 had a private conversation that someone described to me, that they agreed that one of them was going to be killed before the mission was out. And it was just really only a question of which one and when. As it turned out, none of them died during Mercury, but of course, Gus Grissom did in the fire of Apollo 1. And so they were very well aware of this danger. And Glenn was riding atop a more powerful rocket than the one that Shepard and Grissom had ridden. This one was powerful enough to get him into orbit, and it was more dangerous as a result. And it had a very checkered past in terms of its training. So the sense of doom that hung over the public and over the program was intense. And Glenn's flight was scrubbed 10 times over the course of 4 months, for all sorts of problems, technical and otherwise. And so the sense that something was likely to go wrong was only increasing during that period. And it was getting to Glenn too, even though you would never see any sign of it publicly, it clearly was getting to him.
In our last 5 minutes here, Jeff, tell us the highlights of that historic journey of Friendship 7.
Well, it turns out to have been a much more exciting flight and story than I realized. Again, because I know that he went up, he orbited the Earth, he came home. I didn't know that there was more to it than that. But in fact, he orbited the Earth 3 times. And the first orbit went beautifully. But at the end of the first orbit, and I'll leave most of this for the book because I know we're almost out of time here. But at the end of the first orbit, a couple things went wrong. One was that the autopilot, which we talked about before, the autopilot was off. It was going awry, and the capsule was sort of like a car with its wheels skating out of alignment. And so Glenn had to take over the manual control and fly the capsule himself. So while that was a technical problem, it was not unwelcome from Glenn's view, because as I said before, they all wanted to fly the capsule. They knew how to fly the capsule. So this, in a way, was sort of an opportunity for Glenn. The other problem, or apparent problem, was that a warning light went on at mission control, at Mercury control in the Cape, that indicated that at the end of that first orbit, that Glenn's heat shield had started to detach from the capsule. And if that was true, and no one was sure whether it was, then he would be incinerated on the way back to Earth through the atmosphere. And so for the remainder of Glenn's flight, those 2 more orbits around the Earth, Mercury control is in a cold panic and a fierce debate about whether to trust the signal they were getting, and if it was right, whether there was anything that they could do to save Glenn's life. And that debate goes on until seconds, and I do mean seconds, before Glenn turns the capsule and plunges back through the atmosphere to return to Earth. And as he is coming through the atmosphere, and they're tracking something, NASA is tracking something going through the atmosphere, they have no idea what kind of shape that something is in. They're out of radio contact with Glenn, and many of them feel that the worst has happened. So it's an incredibly dramatic story, and Glenn is kept in the dark. They make the decision at Mercury control not to tell Glenn what's going on, which was a source of real recriminations after he got back.
Well, it's famously one of the salutations as he took off was Godspeed, John Glenn, and certainly as he believed in the good Lord was with him. Good Lord, ride all the way, I think he said. You may not have thought this far ahead. I do hope this will become a movie. If you could choose anyone to play John Glenn, who would it be?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I should have a better answer. I will tell you that I adored Ed Harris's portrayal of Glenn in the Right Stuff film, which was 40 years ago now. So I don't suppose he'd be willing to reprise the role. Even though I felt, as I said before, that portrayal was missing something because the book was missing something about Glenn. I do feel that Ed Harris just really captured the kind of electricity of John Glenn in those years. Who could play him today? Boy, I should have a good, quick answer to that, and I don't. But I will. I'll give it some thought. I'll put it on Twitter.
Tell me, and we'll post it.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you so much for this amazing hour. We could go on for many more hours about this history and what came after Mercury, but alas, we must draw it to a close. So again, I just recommend to everyone, get this book. You will love it, and I know it will be a page turner for you as well. And we hope to see all of you back here for our next forum for the Miller Center. And with that, safe travels to everyone.
Thank you, Barbara.